compelling and important group population of bears, and they're so iconic and storied, especially here in this park. And we're really lucky to have Dr. Van Manen with us today to tell us about their past, their present, and their future. So with that, I will hand it off to him, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that introduction, Lori. I just want to make sure, can everyone hear me okay? Like this? Okay. If they're not, I'll put it a little closer and talk a little louder. Is that better? Okay. Well, first of all, welcome. It's wonderful to be here. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you tonight about this iconic, indeed iconic population of grizzly bears. And before we get started, one thing I haven't figured out yet. There we go. I wanted to recognize that what I'm presenting here is really a team effort of a big team and a long-term effort. There have been a lot of different members of the Interagency Grizzly Bear team. This is our current membership. As you can see, very diverse membership from federal, state, and tribal agencies. One person, Justin Swavedison from Grand Teton National Park, is actually here tonight. But I wanted to recognize all the work that all these other people put into this effort. And we'll talk a little bit more about the history of the IGBST here in a moment. Also wanted to recognize a lot of the really nice photos are from Jake Davis. Some of you might know him. He's from the Jackson area, and he's been very gracious letting us use some of his just superb photography. I want to give you a quick overview of what I plan to cover tonight. We'll go into a little bit of history of how we arrived at this point of conservation for this population. Talk a little bit, most of the talk is really about the biology behind that recovery. And then we'll talk a little bit about, what is the future outlook for this population? First, a couple of generalities. The brown bear, grizzly bear is the same species versus Arctos, has a pretty wide distribution across the northern hemisphere. There's about 200,000, there's an estimate of about 200,000 bears, brown bears in the world. That covers about 45 different countries, 44 distinct populations. And you can see here in the brownish area, that's the current distribution. The red area, those are areas where they are now extirpated. So pretty broad distribution. As you can see in North America, we've lost quite a bit of range. And that is more visible here. Right now we have about 52% of historic range is left as occupied range. But notice that this population historically, grizzly bears range all the way into central Mexico. So obviously very different climate conditions there from what we have here. The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem population is the most southern population, and it is still an isolated population. So we'll talk a little bit about the genetic implications of that here in a moment. So let's, and that is obviously on purpose, a little history. Let's talk a little bit about some noteworthy events, and mostly in recent time frames. Of course, grizzly bears, like other large carnivores, suffered the same consequences of persecution in the 1800s and early 1900s. But what I will focus on is more on the last 15 years or so. And that story really, especially in terms of science, starts with the famous Craighead brothers. Many of you are well familiar with them. They are really wildlife pioneers. They were really the first ones to develop radio telemetry techniques, satellite mapping, that sort of thing. It's just a tremendous, and they started that work in Yellowstone in 1959. They did it for about a decade, but it was also a little bit part of a controversy. So some of the conservation efforts in Yellowstone were really a result of some quite a bit of conflict. And some of that started with the famous Leopold report in 1963 that argued that it made recommendations that Park Service management should be moving more towards a natural stage. And so that meant, the recommendations, for example, were to not cull ungulate herds, and also to move bear management away from open pit garbage dumps. And that was really the big controversy. So Superintendent Anderson of Yellowstone National Park in 1967 started implementing the recommendations from the Leopold report. And that meant that they decided to close the open pit garbage dumps where a lot of bears were feeding on human foods at the time. That was very controversial. The Craighead brothers basically said that should be phased out over time. The Park Service instead argued, and I think in hindsight rightfully so, that the best way was to just close them abruptly, wean these animals off that human food resource right away, and not have this continue for generation after generation. I think the data have shown that was the right decision. However, that did result in a lot of mortality in a relatively short period of time. Right around the time that the first closure started, in about a 5-year period, 229 bears died because of conflict situations. And so, because of all those controversies, the Secretary of Interior at the time asked the National Academy of Sciences to look at the status of the population, do a big report, and make recommendations on how to move forward with conservation and management of this population. And so that is a pretty pivotal moment in the conservation of this population. That report came out in 1974, and basically one of the findings of that report was that we might be seeing this population kind of wink out on our watch if we're not careful. One estimate from that work at the time was that the population might be as low as 136. I think with the information and data that we have now, I would say that was probably an underestimate, because most of the information at the time was focused on those open pit garbage dumps, but there were bears that were never using those garbage dumps at the time. So there were probably more bears than 136, but most, perhaps fewer than 250. So this population really was at a pivotal point. That's why it was listed as a threatened. And all grizzly bears in lower 48s, by the way, were listed as threatened under the new Endangered Species Act at the time in 1975. One other recommendation from the National Academy of Sciences report was to establish an independent science team, and that became the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. We were actually established based on kind of early recommendations from that report. So we were actually established in 1973. So we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary year, which is pretty amazing if you think about it as the science consortium that exists. Oh, thank you. It's as I hope you'll see in the coming slides, it's been a pretty amazing effort. And our goals have been pretty broad and pretty modest in a way. And that is, our primary goals are really to conduct research on the status, trend, and distribution of the grizzly bear population, determine food habits, habitat use, and effects of humans and land management activities on grizzly bears. And those are kind of the broader themes. Of course, we do a lot of more topical research that addresses specific questions that Park Service managers or state managers might have, for example. Much of our population monitoring has focused on females with cubs, and you can imagine why that is. That is because it's really the reproductive engine of the population is females, obviously. Females with cubs are also the most recognizable cohort of bears. Once you have females with yearlings or 2-year-olds, they're not always easy to distinguish in terms of the age of the offspring. With cubs, it's pretty obvious when you're seeing a female with cubs, you know that those were born in that given year. So that's why we've historically focused on this population segment, and we've also done a lot of, and so we do that in terms of aerial observation flights, getting observations from field personnel on the ground, telling how many unique females with cubs there are in this ecosystem. And so that's been an important guide for us to really estimate population size. We've also done a lot of capture and telemetry work that really helps us, especially the telemetry, the locations, knowing where these animals are, what their activities are, what they do, how things change from season to season, from year to year, how they're responding to human activities. That is absolutely essential to really be able to understand the ecology of these animals. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those findings here in a moment. One of the key early findings from this effort from the Interagency Grizzly Bear study team was that adult female mortality was simply too high. So through the 70s and even into the early 80s, adult female survival was too low to sustain the population. And so with that was a key piece of knowledge. And in this day and age, you say, well, obviously, we've done a lot of other studies on wildlife, and that is, especially with large vertebrates, that is obvious, a lot of times a really key factor. But at the time, that was kind of a pretty novel finding. And so then the next question was, well, with that knowledge, what do you do? How do you actually effectively use that knowledge to change the situation for the better? And especially given that the species was listed as threatened in 1975. And this is where this whole endeavor is pretty unique, I think. There's not a lot of examples that I'm aware of that have effectively and by design incorporated how to bridge science and policy, which is always in our field and in lots of other fields, but certainly in wildlife management, that is always very challenging. And so with the study team being set up in 1973, the idea was to establish what is called the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, basically the policy arm of grizzly bear conservation in the lower 48s. They cover all populations in the lower 48s. But it was really the Yellowstone situation that kind of propelled that idea and that notion. The idea was that we informed the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee and its subcommittees. So there's a Yellowstone Ecosystem subcommittee about the population status and what potential actions might help the population. And at the time, we'll get into that in a minute, some of the decisions that were made to address that low female survival. So the reason that this is a pretty effective structure is that the IGBST, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, is made up of high-level federal, state, and other representatives, regional directors of the Park Service, for example, state directors of the state wildlife agencies. Those are the people that really can make some decisions. They can together make some decisions based on the science and say, this is what's needed on the ground, and they can actually make it happen. And that's exactly what happened. So with the Grizzly Bear Recovery Program established by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they recognized 6 recovery zones. There's about, right now, the estimates of the number of bears in the lower 48 in these 6 zones, really 4 occupied zones, recovery zones, is about 2,200 grizzly bears in the lower 48. There's really no resident populations in the Bitterroots or North Cascades. There are some occasional records of grizzly bears coming through the Bitterroot Mountains in more recent years, but it's still considered it's not occupied. North Cascades, there's an effort underway to potentially start a reintroduction there, and there's an environmental impact statement being done as we speak. Yellowstone population is very healthy. We'll talk about the numbers here in a minute. Northern continental divide population is over 1,000 animals, very healthy. Selkirk, on the U.S. side, we have about 50 animals. On the Canadian side, about 30. Cabinet Jack has between about 55, 60 animals. So those are smaller populations. So the recovery program, as implemented through the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee and based on and informed by the science from the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, as well as other science teams for the other ecosystems, was really focused initially in the 80s on reducing adult female mortality, developing habitat standards for secure habitats, and that meant restricting motorized access in some areas, retiring livestock allotments and sheep allotments, limiting the amount of new developed sites. So really securing, and this is primarily in the recovery zone, securing that habitat for the long term. Responsive conflict management is another key aspect of this, and the Park Service and the state agencies do a really good job at responding in a timely fashion to some often pretty challenging situations, as many of you are probably aware of. Of course, information, education, outreach has been critical, and I'm really glad to see that those efforts have really stepped up in the last decade or so. And of course, research and monitoring will remain important for populations like this. This will most likely always be a conservation-reliant population. So let's talk a little bit about the actual biology behind recovery. How has this species still been able to survive in this ecosystem where there's actually quite a bit of, if you compare it to places like Alaska and northern Canada, there's a lot of human activity here, and still we have a healthy population of grizzly bears. So before I get into that, let's briefly review the grizzly bear's life cycle, because some of that plays into some of the findings. And we'll start with den emergence, when bears come out of their den, usually anywhere from, males are typically first, females a little bit later, especially cubs, but anywhere from March through early May. Then the mating season is pretty much finished at this point, but May, June, early July. Then this is a critical, from a life history standpoint, for life strategy for grizzly bears. This is the critical time period. It's this period in the fall of what we call hyperphagia, where it's excessive, in our minds, maybe excessive consumption of food, but for bears, it's really critical. They enter the den, but what is really important is for females that have mated that spring, when they mate, their eggs are fertilized, but they don't develop into, they just develop the time of den entry. And so that means, first of all, that the condition of a female, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but the condition of a female before entering the den is critical, not only for her survival, but if she is pregnant, it would also determine whether she could successfully produce cubs that and have those born in the den that year. So the cubs are born usually in anywhere from late January to early February. Then they stay with the female the next year, and then into the year after. So by then they're almost 2 years old, and then early spring of the next year, it's they typically see the family breakup, where the female kind of kicks them off, and then they're on their own. There's sometimes they reunite, as some of you have probably observed here in Grand Teton. There's all kinds of really interesting family relationships between these animals. I don't think we understand half of the social lives of these animals yet, which I think is always really intriguing to me. But it starts the cycle over. So it's a 3-year reproductive cycle. And knowing that most females don't reproduce for the first time until they're about 5.8 years on average, that makes you realize, of course, that reproduction is a slow process for this species. So this is what population recovery looks like for this population in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This is based on some of our latest population estimation techniques called integrated population models, or IPM. And that is literally pulling together all the data that we have: telemetry data, observation data, you name it, mortality data. We put it all together in a very complex computer model, kind of the new way of population estimation. And with that information, we really have, with that data, we have good information about the population trends. So You see actually a little bit of a decline still in the early 80s. Our consistent monitoring started in 1983, basically. We saw some modest increase in the population in the late 80s. Then in the 90s, we started to see a real robust growth. 5.8% annual growth is really robust for a population like this. And then starting in the early 2000s, we started to see that growth slowing down a little bit. 2.3% in the 2000s, and then 0.9% in the 2010s. Last couple of years have been a little bit higher. Just a couple of years of data, so I wouldn't pay too much attention to that, to the very last number. But at this point, we estimate there is about 965 bears in this population. And what is really intriguing here is, why did the population growth started slowing down? And that's one of the questions we started addressing about a decade ago. We'll get to that in a minute. Of course, when you have population growth, you also have population expansion. And if there's any real good measure of conservation success, this is it. We estimate occupied range on every 2 years. We go through a cycle of 1990 to 2022, 2020, 2022. This is where we're at, and then it starts over. But you can see in the beginning, the bears were pretty much restricted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery zone, where all those first conservation actions were implemented, and then gradually started expanding once those protections elsewhere in the ecosystem started playing a role. So range expansion is, I think, a really good measure of success. And we, even based on these time periods, we've basically tripled the occupied range. By the way, this occupied range is estimated based on what we call a moving window of 15 years of data. So we put all the locational data that we have, GPS locations, records of mortalities and sightings, we put it all together into one metric of occupied range. What this also means is that bear density has increased over time. So if we look at 1990, the lighter colors are areas of higher density. So these are cells with blue colors are low density, cells with lighter yellowish colors are areas with higher density. And you can see that some of these areas start lightening up. And those are areas focused in the national parks, wilderness areas, where you have higher densities of bears. And one of the many things that we started looking at was, well, there's not a lot of populations where you can study these effects of population potentially reaching carrying capacity and what kind of intrinsic factors might be operating within a population. There's not a lot of opportunity for that, but because most bear populations are well below that level of carrying capacity because they're harvested population, for example, in Alaska. So we had a real opportunity here to look at some of these factors. And one thing that we found was, starting in the early 2000s, is that in areas with higher bear density, cub survival was lower. And so what you see here, it's cub survival at a low density index. It's just an index. It's not an actual number of how many bears per square mile, for example, but it's at a low index. It's pretty constant until about early 2000, then started dropping a little bit. But look at what happens in areas with higher bear density. Cub survival really starts dropping more severely. Cubs, if you don't have cubs recruiting into the population, of course, that's going to slow down the growth of the population. And that's exactly what we saw happening starting in the early 2000s. So that slowing of population growth that I showed you earlier was really driven by lower cub survival, lower yearling survival. Now, there's lots of different ideas about why that might be. Why is cub survival lower in areas with high bear density? Occasionally, we see in areas with high bear density, like Lamar Valley and Hayden Valley, we see that cubs get killed by big males, for example. They've done a lot of research in Scandinavia, and over there they call it sexually selected infanticide. The idea is that males kill cubs so that they get a new mating opportunity with female and can pass on their own genes to the population. There's less evidence of that over here, to be honest. What we found, and what our colleagues in Alaska found, for example, is that in areas with higher bear densities, younger animals are just more vulnerable. So cubs, yearlings, they're just vulnerable to getting killed, sometimes even by females. So That seems to certainly be a key factor in this. We've also looked at body condition and diet. And one way that we measure body condition is through something called bioimpedance. It's a little machine there. We basically hook up a slight electrical current. Doesn't hurt the animal. The same is also used in humans for sports medicine, that sort of thing. But that gives us an opportunity to actually measure what their percent body fat is, and also what their lean body mass is. And this is a picture that was taken by Dan Staler in the Gardener's Hole in Yellowstone National Park. I think it was back in 2009 or so. But this is our textbook example of what a bear wants to be, right? This is their strategy in life, is to look like this, because this gets them through the winter period. And this, I think this was a male, but if you're a female, it also helps you reproduce and raise healthy cubs. So keep that in mind as we talk about some of these issues. In a recent study, we just published this in Global Change Biology. In a recent study, we looked at lean body mass and percent body fat, and just kind of show you what happens in these animals. You know, with females, they reach kind of the plateau of the lean body mass. So that's body mass without fat included. They reach that about age 7. And for females, that is about 95 kilograms. So whatever that translates, about 200 pounds. For males, that happens later in life. They still bulk up because their reproductive strategy is to compete with other big males. So the bigger you are, the bigger chance of mating success. And that's why it takes longer for males to reach that plateau. And that's for males, that's 162 kilograms. In terms of body fat, so what remains of body mass after you exclude lean body mass, body fat, you know, their strategy is to go into the den, into hibernation, fat as you can be, lots of reserves that gets you through the winter time. And again, for females, they need about 20% body fat at a minimum to successfully reproduce. So a female that actually made it, is pregnant, has that blastocyst, and that might have had a blastocyst implanted in the uterine wall. If she doesn't reach that 20% body fat level, she may not successfully reproduce. So that body fat is for females especially critical, and of course for reproduction critical. So, you know, based on our data, most animals reach that 20% in August or September. We'll have another slide here talking about whether that has actually changed over time. Pretty amazing to see the mule bear eat clover, but they do. That clover is actually pretty nutritious. And in terms of caloric value, some of you probably know this already, but what do you think would be the top one in the ones that are still blank? What is the 7.9? Anyone want to guess what food item that is? Not elk. Army purple moss. These little suckers, they're little chicklets of fat, basically. And so, and this is on a per gram basis. You know, of course, you can't really compare one moth to an elk carcass or something. But they, yeah, on a per gram basis, they provide the most caloric value. Of course, vertebrates, ungulates, elk, you know, bison carcasses, that sort of thing provides a lot too. But you also see white clover in that top list. That might have surprised you, right? But that's pretty nutritious. Some of you mentioned white buck pine. Of course, it's one of the high calorie food resources. Important. Those seeds are a little over 50% fat content, and the rest is divided. What remains is protein and carbohydrates. Very nutritious. Of course, it's an important fall food. That's right when bears need it. And as many of you are probably aware, a little bit. The squirrels, of course, cache those nuts at high elevation white buck pine habitats, and the bears come along and just consume whatever is in the seed cache. So the poor squirrels have to deal with that, and that's just the way it is, I guess. The big guys rule the forest. So, but as we all know, whitebuck pine has declined substantially, starting really in the early 2000s. We've seen lots of mortality of especially adult whitebuck pine trees due to pine beetle, blister rust. So you see a beetle that's actually expunged by a whitebuck pine tree there. Blister rust and wildfires also played a pretty big role. And so if we're looking at the number of mature whitebuck pine trees still out there, it's only about 75% have died. So that's a huge loss for an important high-calorie resource. So back in about a decade ago, we started looking at how are bears responding to that, and what we found was that selection for whitebuck pine in the fall by grizzly bears has declined because the resource, presumably because the resource declined. They delay use of whitebuck pine habitats by about a week, but we also found that it's still a valuable resource when it's a masting species, so it produces a good crop every 2 or 3 years. But when it produces a good crop, bears still take advantage of it. And for a long time, we had this paradigm that whitebuck pine was absolutely critical to grizzly bears. And our research from about a decade ago showed that that was really not the case, because about a third of all bears had almost no whitebuck pine in their fall home ranges. So how can it be an absolutely critical resource when you don't have it even in your home range? So we started looking at what alternative food resources might bears be using. Army cutworm moths, we just mentioned that the high caloric value. This is an amazing system, and some of you might have seen photos of this. But each arrow is pointing at a bear feeding on army cutworm moths at these high talus slopes, high elevation areas. Some of these 13,000 feet in that area, and they'll be coming up in these talus slopes early in the morning to consume the army cutworm moths that have fed all night on the alpine slopes nearby, feeding on the alpine meadows on nectar. They come into the talus slopes basically for thermal refusion. So during the hot day, they crawl into this talus rock, and that's where bears find these army cutworm moths. So they come up fairly early in the morning, start digging around for these moths, and again, very exposed, very high elevations. You hear this rock rolling and rolling. In some cases, lots of bears in one location doing this. And you see in the top left corner, those little army cutworm moths is what they're after. And this is what they were doing all day long. And you might be amazed at the number of moths they could consume in a day. Anybody want to take a guess? Some of you probably know the number already, so don't cheat. 10,000 is pretty close. Multiply that by 4. 40,000. There's been estimates of 40,000 moths a day. Yeah, I mean they can do kind of concentrate. So they can get a lot in one sitting, but still, I challenge you to eat 40,000 in a day. Another important high-calorie food for grizzly bears, of course, is from vertebrates. Basically mostly ungulates from predation and scavenging. And I just want to share with you a couple of really cool pictures from some of our pilots. That we have pilots flying telemetry and observation flights all the time, and they get to see some pretty amazing stuff. And it's not uncommon where of course and this bull elk might have been injured in the rut or something, but they oftentimes go into the water and bears go after them. It's pretty amazing to see that. They also take advantage of winter kills. So this photo was from Pelican Valley in April, and you immediately see so the kills on your left there. You see lots of tracks going to and from. Probably also might be some wolves involved here too, but I think I see at least three bears trying to kind of interact on that carcass and trying to do a bit of action here. And this is a video from the Yellowstone National Park. pretty amazing interactions at these big carcasses. You know, and the reason that so many bears gather around these carcasses is because it's such a resource. So this was in Hayden Valley back in, I think it was 2007 and 2009. And I think they counted about 20 different grizzly bears around this carcass. And if you see there on the very left, it's the yearling that even those kind of take a little bit of risk by going into what's mostly a male environment. So coming back to our telemetry data, especially with GPS telemetry and satellite tracking, we've learned a tremendous amount of what these animals do. And we're just kind of, this is just the tip of the iceberg in some ways. But what we're seeing here is where bears are clustered on the application, but we also get a measurement of activity. How active is the bear? And those colors. So red is an active bear, and yellow is when the bear is inactive. So in the left, in the left panel, you see a bear that was on a carpet, pretty active, feeding probably. Then it moved off to a day bed, and it did that multiple times over a couple of day period. On the right, that bear just decided to stay right on top of the carcass, rest, eat a little bit, rest, eat a little bit, rest, and this can go on for days sometimes. And we were doing some genetic sampling, DNA sampling by collecting hair in Grand Teton National Park a couple of years ago for a particular study. So that's why you see the barbed wire, that's to collect hair samples. But we put it around the remains of an elk, and we got this time lapse of a bear just staying on that elk, eating a little bit, just like I said, and then going back, digging it back up. And this is over, I forgot what time period it was, over a couple of day period. So really interesting to see these type of behaviors in these animals. But coming back to the whitebuck pine decline and how are bears compensating for that, one thing that we found out was we developed what we call a carcass index by using the telemetry data. So when we see clusters of GPS locations, we know that there's typically a carcass that they're feeding on. We tested that, of course, to make sure that we were accurate in those predictions. And then we calculated over time, well, did they maybe start switching to ungulate resources instead of whitebuck pine and other resources that were declining to make up for it in the fall? And that's exactly what happened. We're seeing more carcasses in the fall these days. And that we interpret that as probably a mechanism for bears to shift their diets to other resources that are easier to get than whitebuck pine seeds. Yeah.
Having more trouble.
I don't know that the impact of that would be seen at the population level of elk. I kind of doubt that it would be that drastic. But I don't, no one, to my knowledge, has really looked at that specifically yet. One argument that has been made is that by feeding on elk carcasses, whether that puts grizzly bears at greater risk of mortality. I don't think of hunting season. And what we're finding is that there's really, in our data, is not much support for that hypothesis. Because in that case, we would have seen an increase in mortality rates over time. And in fact, we're seeing pretty stable mortality rates. The highest rate we had was back in 2018. And since then, we've had really pretty sustainable, very sustainable levels of mortality because the population is still increasing, albeit at a slower rate. As part of that effort of looking at diets and diet changes over time, we actually documented over 260 different food items that grizzly bears are consuming in this ecosystem. Doesn't mean that every single bear is eating that many items, but across the population, that's how many different items are being consumed, and that's really pretty amazing number. That's fun affecting the screen a little bit for you guys. Later. So really the term that we use is this is an incredibly opportunistic omnivore. And in this case, Jake Davis was able to take a picture of a nest. I've seen black bears do that in Greater Yellowstone National Park, and it's amazing to see how these animals will consume bees and yellow jackets and hornets. This is a hornet nest actually, and they get stung inside the mouth, and they kind of shake it off, but they keep feeding on it because it is a good source of protein and fat. So with all these changes in foods, we've also cutthroat trout availability has changed dramatically, of course, because of the introduction of lake trout in the Yellowstone Lake. We've seen some elk herds change, some decline, some increase. Lots of things have changed in the ecosystem. So one other thing that we wanted to look at, and we published this recently, was, well, did percent body fat change over the last 2 decades when we've seen tremendous changes in food? What we looked at we looked at the rate of fat gain over the active season, starting in June all the way into basically through October. And what we found was you see 2 lines on top of each other for 2 different decades. So the purplish line is for 2000, 2009. The yellowish brown line is for 2010, 2020, and there's basically no difference. So these animals are still gaining fat the same way they've always have, and despite all the changes and all the different foods in the ecosystem, they're still gaining. And in case of females, they're still gaining that, and getting to that 20% level that you see the dashed line there. That's a 20% level they need for reproduction. They're typically getting to that, and most of them get to that in September. So that is really good news. Same thing for males. We're finding that body condition of males and their ability to gain body weight over the active season has not changed. However, what we have seen is, again, an intrinsic factor. Density is playing a bigger role. What we've seen is in areas with higher bear density, for males, we've seen that they have lower lean body mass, but for females, it's really interesting. For females that are in the growing stage, those females that are 7 years or younger, for those females, they seem to be having a tougher time competing with other bears in those high density areas. Their lean body mass in areas with higher growing females, in areas with higher bear density, their lean body mass is a little bit lower. And in the long run, what that might result in is maybe delaying reproduction, potentially that bears, decades from now might be a little bit smaller than they are now. But this is something that's really interesting to kind of understand and then finally see in the data that these intrinsic factors like density are really starting to play an important role. And that's, of course, how in normal situations, populations regulate themselves, right? They maybe reduce reproduction, lower cub survival that we talked about before. Those are the type of things that kind of set a limit to carrying capacity. And of course, the ecosystem itself too, where carrying capacity is driven by how productive an ecosystem. And I don't know if you can see the 2 bears making out here on the left side, but they sure picked a beautiful spot to have some romance. And I'm showing this because of the implications for genetic diversity. There's been quite a bit of discussion about genetics of this population. It is a little bit lower, and so when we look, it's something called a measure called heterozygosity. It's basically a metric of genetic diversity. If you look at it latitudinally, going from basically Alaska and northern Canada into BC and Alberta and into the lower 48, because the further down you go, the further south you go, the less connected these populations are. They tend to be a little, have lower genetic diversity, and Yellowstone certainly fits into that. Northern Continental Divide is a little bit higher because they're connected to Canadian populations. I wouldn't say it's at a level that raises a lot of concern, but it's something that has raised concern in the past, and it's something that we certainly are monitoring. And the reason is that Yellowstone, again, remains an isolated population. So in 2015, we published a paper looking at something called effective population size, which basically is the number of individuals that contributes genes to the next generation, so to speak. So there's been some research done in the past that set 2 thresholds for that. The lower one is that you need at least 50 animals in the population at a genetically effective population size of 50 to avoid inbreeding. And you need at least 500 to avoid long-term genetic effects. So for long-term genetic viability, you need at least about 500. And as you can see, the green line is what our measure is for this population, the Greater Yellowstone population. And you see in 2005, we're starting to get close to that second threshold. The bottom threshold at 50 is really critical. You want to definitely stay above that. We're well above that. And now we're also reaching a level with this particular metric that applies to long-term genetic viability. So that is really good news. Oh, the dotted lines are what we call confidence or credible intervals. So those tell you how much certainty there is about that number. So keep in mind, there is a lot of uncertainty. That's pretty typical in these type of studies, but there is a lot of uncertainty about those estimates towards the later end, for sure. Thanks for asking. The other good news is that as we've seen range expansion, both in the Greater Yellowstone population, as well as the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, they're getting closer to each other. And let me back up just one moment. What you see here in the estimated occupied range up to 2022 for Yellowstone, up to 2020 for Northern Continental Divide. The yellow lines are the recovery zones established by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Blue lines are Park Service lands. And the blue areas, kind of in the background, those are areas where what Fish and Wildlife Service refers to as maybe present areas. So those are areas, those are basically watersheds where there have been verified observations of grizzly bears. And that is important to kind of help us gauge, well, where might we see future range expansion? But as you can see, there's some areas around both ecosystems where pretty far from occupied range where we're seeing bears pop up. And the area in between occupied range for the two ecosystems is also getting quite a bit closer. So one thing we looked at in 2017 is what potential routes might focus on males, what potential routes might male bears take to get from one ecosystem to another, potentially introduce new genes. So what we're hoping for is, of course, that a male from the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem enters into the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, breeds there, or reproduces offspring, and that would eventually increase genetic diversity in the population. And these darker areas is the route that we predicted where that would be most likely. So they typically follow public land areas. They use national forest areas, potentially as stepping stones. So the Bridger Mountains, the Berkel routes, those type of areas could potentially be really important for that connectivity. But we're only 35 miles away, between occupied range. And for a male bear, that is totally within dispersal range. That the male bear can make it, but they have to cross some barriers. They have to cross I-90, which we know, interstate highways are barriers, not just for grizzly bears, for lots of other species. And there's some, valleys where we have a lot of human activity, in Gallatin Valley, where I live, that's prime example of areas that are a little bit harder to cross. So those stepping stones of national forest lands and places like the Berkel routes might be pretty important. But overall, this is really pretty good news. So, this is really a tremendous conservation success. And I think we sometimes have to remind ourselves of where we came from a population that was about to wink out on us to a very healthy population that's close to 1,000 animals. It's pretty incredible that we have arrived at this point. And so when you look at why is this a conservation success story? If you look at what contributes to that success, and that may not be true for every species, but certainly for grizzly bears in this ecosystem, these are the things that really matter. We had the organizations and people to manage. So that's the federal, state, and tribal agencies that collaborated both on the research end and on the policy end. And they get together every year, twice a year. Lots of deliberations about how to best manage and conserve these grizzly bears in this area. Biological data from study team were critical, of course. There's also always been political support because it's an iconic species in an iconic ecosystem that has helped this species a lot, of course. And as is evident from everyone here, there's always been a lot of public involvement and always a lot of opportunity for public to express their concerns about this population. Not everyone has always agreed, you know, that's almost the case everywhere. But there has been a lot of public involvement. Public has been able to address a lot of concerns that they have, and those have been implemented in. Another really important factor, I think, is that we sometimes forget about is that we probably wouldn't be talking about a grizzly bear population had it not been for Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. You know, national park lands, protected areas are critical. And if you think about, and we'll talk a little bit about this here, what the future outlook is, but if you think about climate change and other things coming down, that those protected areas, I think, will play an even more and more important role in the future. But with all that said, let's not ignore the fact that we should give this animal some credit too, right? This is an incredibly resilient animal. And this quote from Robert Porter Allen, did a lot of work for the Audubon Society with cranes and such, was really a big conservationist. But this quote really captures that you know, the vigor of this species. You know, had it not been for that, we could have done all we wanted, but that might not have succeeded. So let's be sure to make and give this species some credit as well. So then finally, let's have a look at what the future outlook is for this population. And unfortunately, with conservation success, of course, come conservation challenges, right? Management challenges. And if you look at conflicts, that's a really telling number of what is going on in the ecosystem. So what I'm showing you here is the number of conflicts annually within the recovery zone. Remember, the recovery zone is where most of the conservation actions have taken place. 98% federal land, public land, very well protected. Almost no change in conflicts over time. Pretty and relatively low, considering how many people we have visiting this ecosystem and using this ecosystem. Once you start looking at an area, and this is, I haven't pointed out on previous graphs, but a demographic monitoring nation and includes more private lands. And you start seeing, especially in the last decade and a half, conflicts are going up. And then when you go outside of that area, and then outside this area, we're really talking about areas that are really not highly suitable for grizzly bears anymore. Lots of private land, lots of activity, human activities, whether it's agriculture, roads, more trails, that sort of thing. You see that over time, we're seeing as grizzly populations expanded into some of these areas, we're seeing more conflicts in those areas as well. And so, you know, in some of those outlying areas where we're seeing more cattle depredations, and you know, if you're a cattle rancher and a lot of your calves are getting killed by grizzly bears, that is so we have to figure out ways to make this work for everyone. And I don't think we can expect to have all the people that are doing generally are very supportive of grizzly bear conservation. Are doing a great job of land stewardship. They should not always have to carry the burden, of course, of all these conflicts. But in some cases, that is happening. Of course, when you have conflicts, you have bear mortalities. And if you look at how that has changed over decades, it stops here in 2014, so it's a little outdated. We'll update it next year probably. But you see the number of mortalities increase and they expand in the area where you have mortality. That's simply a result of more bears on the landscape in a larger area, increasingly in areas with more human influence. Then the other thing that we should be thinking about, not just for grizzly bears, of course, but for lots of other species, is climate change. This is from a pretty incredible work that was just recently published, a big report, the Greater Yellowstone Climate Assessment. Is freely available online, published in 2021. The top graph shows you the increase in temperature in Fahrenheit, and the lower graph shows you the snow water equivalent, so kind of an indicator of potential drought futures. And if we don't do anything about climate change, right? At this point, we're on track with basically on track with the red line. So you can see that's a pretty drastic change in temperature and snow water equivalents. Hopefully, we'll end up somewhere in between the red line and the blue line. So this white line is the current period. This is here 2100. But needless to say, this ecosystem could see substantial changes. How are bears going to respond to that? One thing that we started looking at already with University of Idaho and Washington State University is what about heat stress for bears? Is that a consideration? And the good news is that so that you see the map here shows Yellowstone National Park in outline. Blue areas are basically okay, relative low risk of heat stress for bears. Red areas are areas that are relatively have more potential for heat stress for bears if there is no access to water. So you see there on the left, the top graphs are for a scenario where bears would not have access to water. That's unlikely. I think most bears will, even in some of the worst climate change predictions, will still have access to water. But even then, only in July would there be potential for heat stress. If there's access to water, that kind of takes that out of the picture altogether. So access to water will remain really important. Now, this is a little more critical for bears that are lactating, we found. If females that are lactating, so are nursing cubs, the heat stress potential could be a little bit higher. So that's where access to water would be really, really important, especially in months like July. Bears do a lot of other behavioral things. They can go into the water, of course, but they also have day beds that they dig down to mineral soil. They lay down, and then just the coolness of the earth basically cools them down. That is very effective. So there's other ways that behaviorally bears can handle that. And remember, bears used to occur in central Mexico, so they can cover a lot of different climates. But it's something that certainly we still want to look at. The other thing is, how is it? So even if that picture is pretty positive in terms of bears dealing with heat stress, what is our picture going to look like in terms of future forest composition, landscape composition? It's predictions of regeneration failures of pine forests, mostly conifer forests, being pretty bleak. Even in some of the more optimistic scenarios, like you see on the left. You see lots of areas, and especially in the core of the ecosystem, where what is that going to do to the communities? Not just the grizzly bears, but lots of other species. And of course, we have people. We deal with people everywhere. Now people are showing up in remote areas on e-bikes, and there's a lot more use of backcountry areas that in the maybe a couple of decades ago were much more of a refuge for bears than they are now. How are bears going to respond to that? Some of you work, I think, for the Bear Brigade here in Grand Teton National Park. How do we manage all this, the viewing and the challenges that come with that? There's some substantial challenges that go along with more visitation. And if we look at the trends over time, I'm not sure what happened in the last year, but I think maybe the flood, at least in Yellowstone, might have had something to do with it, with the little bit of a drop in the last year. But the trend is clear that we're going to see more visitation in the future. So what kind of pressures is that going to put on populations that really need that kind of backcountry area with not too much human disturbance? Same with when you look at change in residential areas on a regional scale. We're right here in the heart of an area that has seen over that time period from 2001 to 2010, seen change in residential area of more than 50%, and that stands out even in the entire Northwest, which we know already stands out in the country. So, what is that going to do? And we're going to see more of this. And I'm not trying to be dramatic here, but these are the results of more people, more roads, more cars, more recreation. We all are part of it, and I'm as much to blame as anyone else in this room. And so collectively, what can we do to help resolve this system and resolve these challenges and make sure that we really have a future for this species. And the more and more we look at this, the more we start thinking in terms of what we call source sink dynamics. And what you see in this map, this was work done by our study team in 2010. The red areas are areas where there's high female survival. And remember, female survival is the key to population growth, right? So female survival is high in the red areas. In the blue areas, it's low. What are the patterns you're seeing there? What stands out here? Well, it's red areas are relatively few people because those are all public lands, Forest Service, Park Service lands. And in some of the other areas, except for the Wind River Reservation that provides some really good habitat, but where there's more people, female survival goes down. And so we found that female survival generally is below 0.9. So if more than 9 out of 100 females, adult females, die in the population every year, and you have what we call a sink. That's a population sink. That's where the population is not going to grow. In these yellow colored and light colored areas, those are the areas that are what we call source. Those are areas where the survival of females is greater than 0.91. Those areas should be able to sustain populations over time. The blue areas are most likely in the future going to remain sink areas. And so the reason I show that is that brings up the question of we need to, and this may be an uncomfortable question for some, but we have to think about the questions of how many bears do we need in this landscape and where can we tolerate, where can people tolerate them? And those are uncomfortable questions, but those are questions that are important to manage this population successfully and really guarantee that it has a bright future. So just to quickly repeat some of the key points that we've learned in 50 years of science and policy. Critical point is that the U.S. Endangered Species Act was very effective. It's a very strong piece of legislation that helped not just grizzly bears, but lots of other species. But it was absolutely critical to the recovery of this population. Also critical that I think kind of goes in sync with that is that we have very well protected areas. Yellowstone National Park is very big. We have connected, the Rockefeller Parkway and Grand Teton National Park. Those have been absolutely critical and will be critical for the future of this population. We had interagency science that directly informed interagency policy by design. And we had visionary management that was a result of that through the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee and its ecosystem subcommittees. And those really contributed to the conservation success that we've seen. And of course, I mentioned it, the resilience of grizzly bears. Species biology plays a role in this. They are opportunistic omnivores. They've been able to deal with a lot of changes in the ecosystem. They still will be able to deal with lots more changes coming into in the ecosystem in the future. But it was absolutely important part of biological recovery and the resilience of this population. So for future consideration, we really need to start thinking about conservation frameworks that integrate biology, science, land change science, and climate change, human economics. Students from the University of Wyoming are working on that with some really, really good modeling of bioeconomic models. Very important work that needs to be done. And we need to incorporate more human dimension work into that. And so I'm really glad to see that effort being done by the University of Wyoming, because I think it will be absolutely critical for species like grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Before I end up, I wanted to mention one thing. And as here we talk about grizzly bears, and we've put lots of resources. If you count the number of the dollar amounts that annually go into conservation and management of this population alone, it's pretty tremendous. And I think it's great. I'm being the first one to say that, of course. But let's not forget that brown bears and black bears are the only two bear species in the world out of the 8 that are listed as least concern by the IUCN. The other 6 species are listed as vulnerable, and that means that they are at high risk of extinction. And so I want to point that out because we should not lose track of these other species where if you look at sloth bears in India or Sri Lanka, for example, where I've had the privilege to do some work in Sri Lanka, the resources aren't there to protect those populations. So think about those populations and think how you might be able to support that work through means. And so I've been involved with the International Association for Bear Research and Management for a long time, served on its council for 15 years. And that organization is also looking at North American bears, but also putting a lot of efforts into these other species that also deserve lots of attention. So with that, I wanted to really thank you for your attention. And also wanted to thank many of you in this room probably have contributed data to us in the past, female with cub sightings and that sort of thing. We benefit from the assistance of hundreds of people every year, and over the course of 50 years, I cannot imagine the thousands of people that have been involved in this work over time. And again, this is really a team effort that I'm incredibly proud of to be part of. It's really been a privilege. And I hope with that we can secure the future of this important population. And I'll leave you with some synchronous bear rubbing. Easy that is. Yeah, that's right. So, and even go down at the same time. I mean, only the departure could have been a little more synchronous, but you'll see that in a minute. But that one had an extra. But yeah, thank you so much. Yes, first one. Well, we'll start here in the.
Population is pretty sustainable. That's the question: when and where? When do? And I'm on the other side of this issue, but I'm playing devil's advocate.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
When do you stop the expansion and intervene? How do you communicate with the ranchers and farmers where the biggest problems for them?
Yeah, I don't know if everyone was able